everyone. Thank you for joining the April instance of Roshni and Friends. I think soon to become just Roshni and Ravi PM series. Today we're just going to go over the very nerve-wracking technical session, or the technical part of PM interviews, which I know personally for me is like my Achilles heel. And a lot of it is because I don't have a computer science background. My undergrad was in biochemistry and biophysics, so like not helpful for anything really, except for being a doctor. And so I decided to put this together with Ravi, it's his strength to do this. Just a quick background on me. I'm currently director of product at Blue Crew, which is a startup that no one has heard of, but hopefully in a year, everyone will have heard of it. Before this, I was at Amazon for about 6.5 years, non-contiguously, and have done around 80+ interviews for them, including technical product management, regular product management, program management, a whole bunch of stuff. And so I thought I'd start this series because there's a lot of people out there who don't know what a good response looks like, or like what to study for, what to look for. Ravi, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So like Roshni said, I also went to business school from 17 to 19. In the past 18 months, I've been working with Google as a product manager in Google Workspace. I'm one of the product managers on Gmail and Chat. So before that, I worked in BCG in its digital practice. So that's where I first got introduced to this function of product management. And I'm a civil engineer by education. So the topic of technical round is as alien to me as it were to Roshni. But it just so happened that I worked in BCG for a few years in its digital practice, and I happened to learn a lot on the job. And that really helped me get a lot of technical intel and also do these technical rounds a little bit better than what I would have been otherwise. Why I wanted to do this along with Roshni is for the exact same reason. You know, when I was preparing for the technical round, this was one area where I found very little structured information on how to prepare. There are a bunch of blogs which had a lot of scattered resources, but I thought back and said, you know, what would I have used the most, right? Is a session like this, where two people who've gone through all of this, share their experiences. I felt I could benefit from it, and I wanted to give that to people who are preparing for these roles now. So yeah, thank you all for taking the time. Excited for this session.
Okay, we're gonna try to do it so that everything we go over today takes less than like 20 minutes or so, and then we'll leave the rest of the time for Q&A, which won't be recorded. So feel free to ask any question that you have. So today, you know, after the quick intro, we're just gonna go over what is the purpose of the technical round, right? Because you're not gonna be coding, so why is a PM doesn't matter. And then we're just gonna go over like some resources to prepare for the technical round. We have a whole bunch of hyperlinks and notes in this presentation. So I'll be sending this presentation out to everybody on the Eventbrite list after. And then we're gonna role play 2 common questions that you may see. One is more technical than the other, but they're both the type of questions that you'll see in the technical portion of either a technical product manager interview or a technical program manager interview. And then finally, as I mentioned, we'll leave time for Q&A. So the purpose of the technical round is mostly to torture you. No, I'm just kidding. It's mostly just to see if you have like some of the common knowledge needed to be able to have some sort of like a common vocabulary or starting ground to chat with your engineers, right? It's very difficult to come up with ideas or improvements to a product if you don't even really like have any idea of what the tech stack could be and what it is and like what it is that the engineers are working on. And so that's really the whole point of the technical round. And you'll find sometimes like people will, interviewers will ask questions that seem kind of cruel, but like that, usually that doesn't happen. Usually most of the interviewers want you to just like show some knowledge around it. Of course, if you're applying to like a very specific portion of AWS or maybe even a very specific portion of Google, they will require more deeper knowledge. But just for a general technical product manager or just a regular product manager role at Google. Like they're just looking for like your ability to break down problems. So on that note, one of the biggest things that you're looking for as a hiring manager, and especially what I look for is your ability to be able to break down really large ambiguous problems into smaller pieces, which is something that really good engineers do all the time. And so when you join as a product manager in a team where problems can be very large, very technical, just being able to scope the ambiguity of the problem is really important. And so sometimes you'll get a technical question that actually isn't that bad. It just seems way more scary than it is. And so you kind of have to stop your brain from freaking out right when you hear the question, and actually take a minute, write down everything that you know and what you know about that topic, and then go from there. And you'll see that happen when we role play. Generally, when hiring managers ask you questions during the technical round, they're just trying to see whether actually what the product tech stack is, like how the data was flowing, like what were some of the engineering problems that engineers ran into. So when you're telling, sharing stories that are more technical, being able to use the right vocabulary and the tech stack and any problems that you ran into are very important, because then it actually shows that you know what you're talking about and you're not just like making up a tech story. And then, as I mentioned, the right vocabulary is paramount over everything else, because as a hiring manager, it gets very easy to figure out when somebody's lying versus not, just based off of the vocabulary that they're using. Ravi, go ahead.
Yeah, Roshni, I wanted to echo one particular thing, right? When engineering managers ask you an ambiguous question, it's really, really useful, the advice that you've given, right? To just pause and take a step back and see what the problem is all about, and see what are the constituent parts that you can solve individually. Because often problems are a set of smaller problems, which are all easier to solve in parts and then join later. So I found that advice particularly useful even in my interviews. So +1 to that. Now going to the resources that we have here. This is what I did, and I think this is to some extent what Roshni has also done. There is no one right answer on how to prepare for a technical round, especially for interviews like Google, where the book is a little bit more open. The questions can come from anywhere. They really call them googly, right? There's no set structure for where the questions can come from and what topics will be touched. So there can really never be a right answer for how do you prepare for a technical round, at least at Google. What we've tried to put together here is a set of resources that generally help you with developing good context and understanding of the overall area, right? So if you've gone through some of this, you just feel a little better prepared to answer any kind of questions that come your way, right? You should always start with brushing up your understanding of system design. And the exact detailed system design is not usually done by product managers, it's done by engineers. So what engineering managers are really looking for is there some person that I can partner with while I'm making some of those decisions, right? Can this person be a thought partner while I make those decisions? That's all they're looking for. So when there's a hyperlink in there, go inside and read it. I think it's mostly about, given a certain problem, what kind of stack would you have, right? And we'll discuss that a little bit more during our role play. But what would the server look like? Would you have like a web server? Would you have a database server? What's the scale of the server space that you would need? Just ballpark understanding of how that stack would look like. That's really helpful. And then the second part is refresh memory of all the previous work that you've done, particularly tech related. So invariably the question that ends up coming is, hey, tell us about a project that you really enjoyed, right? Tell us about the project that you've learned a lot from. All they're trying to do is to really stress test what you've written on your resume, right? They want to call bullshit when they see it. And they're definitely going to ask you some follow-up questions. So they would know whether you've really done that work or not. So it always helps to sort of think about all the previous good tech work that you've done and imagine them at a level of detail, right? Until refresh all the last mile detail so you can defend when follow-up questions come your way. Then the next is really nothing particularly technical about these, but it just helps you understand what's happening in the tech world, right? The Information, Stratechery, and Wired are all publications or newspapers or whatever you call them. It generally helps to read them regularly so you are in the know of what's happening in the tech world, right? Who's acquiring who? Why does that make sense? Which products are doing well? What's the business model of different companies? All of that context is really, really helpful. And then the point number 4 is just a laundry list of a bunch of topics that I really dug deep into while I was preparing for my tech interviews. So how does internet really work, right? What happens when you type the URL bar, the address in the URL bar and press enter? What really happens in the background, right? That's a question that I actually know that someone got asked. Then high level understanding of what database technologies exist and what are the pros and cons of each, what's the purpose of each, what are APIs, when are they used, general understanding of cloud. I think this has become a very important component of the internet architecture. What are some of the specialties of AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud? What is Kubernetes platform? These are all things that require a couple of hours of studying. So you develop like a holistic picture on what these are. And the last, Roshni, would you like to cover this? I think this is more specific to Amazon. I haven't heard this a lot at Google.
So at Amazon, because a lot of it is just ranking, right? The whole website is literally just ranking and personalization. You really stand out as a candidate if you know anything about ML, especially how ML is applied to ranking and personalization and just general regression. It's actually not that hard to like read up on it and like just know how this stuff works. And so I always advise anybody who's going to go through like the technical product manager position at Amazon to at least like read up on ML stuff just to impress the interviewer.
Oh,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Roshni.
I was just going to say, and one note on The Wired, it was actually a cloud computing article on The Wired from like 2009, 2008 that convinced me to keep my 2012 Amazon share when AWS was just like, starting to get up, and it was the best decision I've ever made because the stock price has gone up so much since then. So the great thing about like the Information, Wired, and I can never pronounce Stratechery, is that it just helps you figure out what is happening in the world. And like eventually when you read this stuff enough, you can like start taking ideas from one industry and then applying it to the other. And it just helps with idea generation for the technical rounds as well.
Yeah, and one thing that I would add is just be very inquisitive when you're going about studying some of these things, right? For example, when you start to read about how internet works, for example, you'll start to see terms like, hey, there is a DNS server, which is where the URL gets converted to an IP address, and there's an IP address lookup. Whenever you see a term that you don't quite understand, dig into it, right? And spend a few hours, just get into that rabbit hole, and really, fulfill your creative desire, right? That's how you really venture out and understand a lot of, dig into a lot of these tentacles and develop a much better perspective. The more time you spend, the better you come out of this process. There's really no secret beyond that. This is just a starting point. These are just doors for that rabbit hole, but you have to get into that.
I know for, those of us who don't have a technical undergrad, like, oh man, it can seem like such a nightmare to have to go through this, but like, if you really want to start off somewhere, maybe start off with the how does the internet work videos that I've posted in the speaker notes of this presentation, which is literally a kid's version of how the internet works, how computers work. And it's way more interesting than like, than just starting off with like a really big website that goes over everything. But yeah, so just wanted to say that I know this stuff can seem really, really overwhelming when you see the list. Like if you don't know what any of this is, it can just get exhausting. I know that for sure. And so now we're gonna switch to the role play section where Ravi and I are going to just role play a couple questions that you may see in the technical round. Normally what I like to do is show what a bad response looks like versus a good one and all of that. But instead here we decided to just go for more types of questions that you may see and what a good response would look like, rather than going over what a bad response is, because I'm sure we all have some idea of what a bad response looks like. Okay, so I'm going to be the hiring manager in every case, because it's a lot of anxiety performance. Performance anxiety. Oh my God, there you go. Okay, what a lot of performance anxiety that comes with having to role play. So I'll get started with the first question. Ravi, can you just tell me about your most technical project?
Sure. When I was at BCG before business school, one of the projects involved us building a sales enablement tool for our client. What that meant was, until that point, the sales team had no idea how much they were selling, who were they selling to, where would they get collateral. Such a digital tool doesn't exist. And I was one of the product managers that was building that digital tool. The most technically complex thing that I've come across is how do you process loads of data? That was a mutual fund that I worked with, and they get about 1 million rows of data every day on the sales that happen in the market. And what would be helpful for the sales team is to synthesize that 1 million rows of data into a few rows of insight and give that to the sales team every morning as an input to the day, right, on what's happening in the market. So the technical challenge was there existed no system to do that analysis and feed that data into our website, our enablement tool that we were creating. So I went out looking on what the right solution is. So the easy answer is, hey, you get that 1 million rows of data. Why don't you use a software like R or something and process the data every day and feed the results into the system, right? That's just intuitive because you don't have to do any additional bulk work when you begin the project, right? You can plug and play starting tomorrow.
How large was the data set that you were trying to process every day?
It was a 1 million rows a day, but then every week you would also process the data for the week. So it adds up very quickly, right? At the end of the year, you have like 365 million rows, right? So that's like a lot of rows of data to process. And you have to do that all overnight, right? Because every morning you're getting this new dump. So you really don't have a lot of hours to process that data.
And how did you decide on going with R over anything else that's there, like Hadoop? Like, I imagine this is probably like a terabyte of data, right?
Right. So R was what, was on the top of our minds, right? Because, that's like a free solution to begin with. The mutual fund that we were working with did not have any such softwares in-house. So that's what we first thought that we would do, right? But when we really discussed the solution more, what felt like the right thing to do is to plug our tool directly to the source and not have any manual intervention, right? So the two options we had is, one, you take the data every day, there's manual intervention, you process it and you feed the data back. The second is you build out a system that plugs to the source. There used to be a regulatory authority that sort of collects all the data and used to give it to us. The other way is to have a pipeline to the regulatory authority and get the data directly to the backend database of the system and process it all behind, which is all fully automated. And we would just have some checks and balances that would alert us when something is not going right? So that definitely felt like, option 2 definitely felt like the right answer for the long term. So we really took our time to push back on the client and said, hey, we will need 5 more weeks to be able to build the solution. But when we build it, you will need just one person to maintain it as against 3 data engineers who are mining that data for you every morning. And then the reason it was very technical is we did not have a data cloud. We did not have a place to store the data. All of that had to be built ground up, right? The entire stack. So we to have a database server, then we have to have a web server, build the APIs connecting them both, all of that good stuff.
Got it. And how did you decide on which checks and balances to have?
So that is where you will wear your product hat, right? As against a technical hat. What you would know is you would also get a high-level industry report that this mutual fund has sold these many crores of funds that day, right? That's the top-down data. And then you're accumulating bottom-up data based on the raw sales transactions, and they have to match up, right? So there was a non-user visible check that we would do at the backend, which only tells that one person who's maintaining the system that something is off, and that person would investigate.
Got it. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you. What I loved about Ravi's example is that it's not one. I totally thought he'd say one from his time at Google, but he actually did one from consulting, which was awesome. And he gave it in a concise way. He didn't overcomplicate, but he also used the right vocabulary. And then like he was able to figure out where my questions are going to go. Obviously, you know, I can ask a lot more follow-up questions, but like the point is to show that even if your core job from when you're giving your example was not as a product manager, because Ravi was a consultant, right? And it wasn't it wasn't like a inherently what you thought would be what a product manager does. You can still give it as an example, because the whole point is to talk about the complexity of what it was and how you approached it and why you did this versus that, like, you know, how you picked R over other things. Like that's where you can really showcase your knowledge. So you don't necessarily need to have done PMing in a technical team in order to show off your technical chops in the technical round.
Yeah. And the one thing that I would say is take the interviewer along with you in your thought process, right? You know, it's almost like the interviewer is able to visualize what you've gone through, right? You're telling them the problem. You're telling them the two paths that you had in front of you. It's almost like the interviewer is sitting at the table with you trying to make a decision, right? And you tell the pros and cons of each and why you chose one option over the other. That kind of structured walkthrough in just a few minutes, that's really helpful.
Yep, for sure. Okay, the second question is going to be a little bit more involved. And this is the type of question that you may see if you apply to Google or if you apply to like specific parts of AWS. And what I want to try to do here is make it so that we give a minute or so pause so that the audience can think about how they would respond to this. And Ravi can also like, you know, gather his thoughts. And so it'll be more realistic. But okay, you are the CTO of a small sized company for about 200 people. And it's a manufacturing company that's tasked with designing RFID based access systems. How would you design it?
I'll take a minute to collect my thoughts, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Roshni, I had a few questions to understand to make sure I get the problem right. Mm-hmm. When I think about an RFID system, this is what I have in mind, and tell me if I am thinking about it the right way. You often have a card, an RFID card, which is your access system. And then you have an RFID reader at every entry point, which is where you would present the card and that would give you access based on your access controls. Mm-hmm. That's the system that you want designed for the company.
Yep.
Okay. And how is the company structured? Is it like a big warehouse with just one entry point, or is it like a multi-storied, several entry points? How would you like the design to be?
For the purposes of this question, let's just go with one entry point.
Okay, sounds good. And what other purposes apart from access control does this RFID system have? Did you want to take attendance using this? Any other purposes you envisage, or is it purely an attendance, an entry controller?
It would be used for attendance, and let's just say that it would be used as a way to figure out whether somebody has clocked in or clocked out of a shift.
Okay. Sure, that sounds good. So here's how I'm thinking about the problem. Considering we've simplified the requirements a little bit, this is what I have in mind. So there is just that one gate to the manufacturing plant, for example, which is where we would have the RFID reader. And every employee would have an identity card, which would be an RFID card, which they will have to present to get access. Okay. Those are the two components. And then what happens when you actually present the data? This is how I'm thinking about it. The RFID reader, so the good thing here is that there is no digital user interface, right? So it's almost like, the RFID reader can directly interact with the backend system and can give you access or not. There is no need for a front-end web server, if you will. You can directly encode the entire logic into the database server. Mm-hmm. because there's no user visible change. I'm not entering my login credentials in a front end. I'm just presenting my data. The data is read by the RFID reader, and the RFID reader directly sends back data to the validation system. So the way I envisage the system is a very simple backend server, considering it's just 200 people. I almost think that one of the employees' systems, one of the employees' laptops can also develop as a server, just for you to save costs. And that can serve as one place where you save all the data related to the employees, get all the pings from the RFID reader whenever someone is trying to enter the system, and that's how you would validate it. In terms of components, I see this being very, very simple. Just the card reader and a server.
What about the part where it has to connect to some sort of a time tracking system?
So the way I think about it is, while there is no need for a user interface for the employees, I think it would be helpful to have a user-facing system for the administrator, because what we would record is every time the card is presented at the reader, we would record the timestamp and send it back to the server and record it. And when the administrator is trying to look at the whole data, we would present, when the user has clocked in and clocked out.
Okay. So then, going a little bit deeper, what type of data would you store in the RFID card, in the reader, in the database?
Yeah, and I actually think that the amount and nature of data that you would store in these three different places is different, just because of the use cases. All the RFID reader needs to know, all the RFID card needs to know is what your unique identity is, like how do you identify that employee? And second, which all access points does this employee have access to? Right now we have just one access point, which is very simple. But in the future, if you want to scale the system and have multiple access points to that godown or to that plant, the card needs to know which access points you really have access to, right? You might want to control some other access points to just some employees. So really, if you just have these two data points on the card, that would be good enough, right? So you present the card, you would know who's coming in. And the second question is whether that person has access at that access point or not. That's it. Right. But when you come to the RFID reader, you might want to flip the view and say, for this particular access point, which all employees have access to this access point, right? Or the RFID reader can even be dumber and say that, hey, my only job is to collect which employee ID has come here and check with my backend database to see if this employee ID has access here or not, right? Mm-hmm. For such a dumb RFID reader, the only thing the reader needs to know is its own unique code, right? What's my own unique code, so that the server can tell me that this employee has access at this particular unique code, right? So the only thing I would store at the RFID reader is its own unique code that I would pass it along to the server. Now, when I imagine the data flow, the RFID reader would have the employee ID, right? And it will come to the RFID reader. The RFID reader would take the employee ID, the RFID reader's unique code, and send a combination of these both to the server and ask the question, hey, if this employee is trying to enter this location, do I grant the access or no? Right? And the server would just simply give you a yes or no response.
Got it.
And based on that, you would just act on it.
So then how would you figure out, let's say it's after hours, right? Where would that data be stored? Which part of the components would this be stored in? Yeah.
So all the logic we would just encode in the server itself, right? Any rules that you want to impose, for example, let's say post 5 p.m., all the employees have the access shut off, for example, right? That's a role that you would encode, right? Then the server would first think for itself, hey, at what time is this request coming to me? If it's before 5 p.m., I will give access, or else it's a no, right? And we can add a bunch of more complexity on the server side by adding a bunch of more rules. For example, you would say that if there are shifts in the factory, for example, you would say employees in shift 1 have access from 8 a.m. to 12 noon. whereas employees in shift B will have access from 12 p.m. to 5 p.m., for example.
Got
All
it.
of that can just be encoded in the
So
server.
from what you're saying, you essentially want like a brain model where the server is the brain and then everything else is literally just the appendages, right? So then what
Yeah.
are some risks to centralizing decision making to this one server?
Yeah. So there are a few risks, right? The first risk that I can think about is someone stealing the employee's card and just getting access to the system, because the system is just plain dumb, right? You present a card, it gives you the access. Well, that's a security risk. That's not quite a technical risk. The technical risk that I would see with what I've proposed is I propose that we will just develop one of the employees' machines as a server. That sounds very cheap, but it also comes with the risk. What if the employee just shuts his machine,
Yeah.
right, without knowing that that machine is also having other purposes? Or what if the employee does some malicious activity on that particular machine? So a slightly safer model would have been to have like a dedicated server, which the admin controls with enough capacity that it and enough power backup and enough internet backup and all of that machine is always reliable.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you, Ravi. Well, that was, I don't know if during the minute long pause, if you came up with a solution that's similar to what Ravi had, but there's no real one right answer. I mean, there are stupid answers, but like you could have really gone in multiple different ways, right? You could have had some of the logic stored in the RFID reader. You didn't have to do it in the server. But as long as you talk about the pros and cons of whatever approach you're presenting, then that's good enough. What I also really liked is that, to Ravi's former point, he like walked the interviewer through his thought process, and he did it really well, really concisely, and you could show that he was confident in his response. Usually what you'll find is if somebody hasn't prepared well enough for the technical round and you ask them a question like this, which now that we've gone through the response, it's actually not that difficult, but it sounds super difficult. It's very jarring, and a lot of people just end up like just having a verbal vomit. And I've done this for sure before, and I still do it. And so this is where, having the confidence and taking a pause for a minute before responding really, really helps.
I want to add two things there, Roshni. I think there are a few things that I want us all to take away, right? So one is the fact that you had some sense of what kind of infrastructure you needed for what kind of problem, right? When I said that, hey, there are just 200 people, one of your employees' machines could develop as a server. What that indicates to the interviewer is that this person has a sense of what kind of machinery to put behind what kind of problem, right? And that already tells you a lot. The second is, you've already thought through a bunch of risks to the design, right? By doubling up an employee's system as a server, you're saving on some costs, but you're setting up yourself for a bunch of technical risks, right? So interviewers really like if you have an answer, but you also know where there are holes in that answer, right? You're self-aware to the extent that you know what the undercomings of your design are, and you work with engineers to overcome them. So these two components generally help you navigate these interviews a little bit better.
Awesome. Well, thank you.